Hello, everyone. Let's go around the Big Ten. It is February 3rd, 2025. This is going to be another transfer portal edition of the podcast. We talked about our top 5 teams from the Big Ten last week in the transfer portal for the winter cycle. We are now looking at our most impactful players that we've compiled. We've compiled 15 players. Each of us have compiled 15. There's a pretty good amount of overlap, but it's not a perfect circle. There's some extras there for each of us, so we'll get into those as well. This was all sorts of interesting to do. I would have liked to have done like 30 after we started doing this. I'm like, boy, because we were going to do 10, and then I'm like, no, we got to do at least 15 because picking between number 8 and number 12 was so difficult. And so we got to do at least 15. And I was like, boy, we could do 25 or 30, but then now we're getting to like hours worth of show. So we did 15. Big Ten's been really good in the transfer portal. Chip may have looked at things a little differently than myself in terms of how he compiled this. What I kind of looked at was like impactful. So it's not necessarily the 15 best players that have entered the Big Ten for me. There are some guys who I think are better than others on this list. Like there's a guy or two I left off, 1 or 2 that are going to Michigan and 1 or 2 that are going to Ohio State that I think are probably better than some of the guys on this list, but that I don't think are going to have quite the impact that some of these other guys are going to have on their respective team. So there's going to be some of those picks here in terms of just maybe not one of the best 15, but most impactful 15. Chip, how did you approach this? Did you similar way or?
Yeah, no, I like the way you described that as impactful. And obviously, I mean, just in the, before we start going through this, I think like to the average person, they'll be thinking, okay, like these are going to be the like all offensive skill players. And the reality is that's not the case. I mean, like I mean, in the interest of disclosure, yes, there are offensive skill players, but impactful players can be, on the line of scrimmage, regardless of whether we're on the offensive or defensive line. A case in point being is that a couple years ago, and this is not meant as an indictment on him, but I was in Ohio Stadium watching the Ohio State spring game and watching Josh Fryer struggle mightily at left tackle. No offense to that young man. I think he has a very bright future at the next level. And wouldn't you know that, okay, as soon as the spring concluded, Ohio State came to the conclusion, something, we need a premier offensive left tackle, and they went out in the transfer portal. At the time, fans were kind of outraged, like Josh Simmons, this guy from San Diego State, I can't believe that's the best they could do. Now he is projected, granted, he's coming off an injury, but he's projected as a first-round draft choice in the NFL. So my point being is that an impactful player can be a lineman. It can be somebody that is not necessarily touching the ball, because if you don't have adequate protection, if you don't have somebody that is applying pressure to the opposition's quarterback, that can be, something that can definitely have an impact on your team. So that's kind of where I came with, like when you're talking about impactful, same kind of a mindset.
So what I'll try to do here is go through guys that overlap on both of our lists. Mm-hmm. And we'll get to the end and we'll each probably have a couple guys who's, a couple on my list, a couple on Chip's list that aren't the same. And I'm sure, again, I would have loved to go like 25, 30 on this. There's some guys I left off where I'm like, do I really have to leave them off? But I got to stop somewhere. So let's start with quarterback. I know we just did the lineman speech, but let's start with quarterback.
Yeah.
We both have Fernando Mendoza transferring from Cal to IU to Indiana. For those who are unfamiliar, I guess I should use abbreviation. It might be IU. Is that? But Fernando Mendoza to Indiana from Cal, projected to be Indiana's starting quarterback. Indiana did a really good job getting Curtis Rourke out of the portal last year. That led to a lot of success for them. They really needed to get a difference maker quarterback. I think Mendoza was, if not the best, certainly one of the best quarterback prospects in the entire transfer portal. Indiana gets him. Look, if they want to keep this going, they want to just not be a blip on the radar this past year, you got to bring in a high-end quarterback, and I think they did that here.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, I mentioned it on a previous show that, I mean, all the credit in the world to Curt Cignetti, the way that they use the transfer portal. And again, I'm going to go back to the fact that, all right, you can't build your team, long-term through the transfer portal. But I think the way that Indiana so far in the Curt Cignetti era has been very wise, very selective in terms of at critical positions. And I think Fernando Mendoza coming in to take over for Curtis Rourke, he's certainly going to keep that Indiana offense running at a high level.
No doubt. And then right here at the top of the list again, And that's, I think, is that the only quarterback either of us have?
Actually, no. I did go. I do have Marc Gronowski of San Diego State to Iowa. Okay. Logic there is, all right, Iowa has, always been a very solid Big Ten program, but what's been holding them back is a lack of, a dynamic offense. And, I'll just say that at the quarterback position, they've had adequate play, but nothing really spectacular. I think Marc Gronowski coming in from South Dakota State, even though it's an FCS program coming up into the Big Ten, I think that Gronowski has the ability to help that Iowa offense get to the next level and possibly be more of a contender within the Big Ten.
He was a guy I considered, just didn't make my cut. It is funny, though, like almost all those Big Ten programs last year had a portal quarterback. We've seen a little less portal activity at the quarterback position this year in the Big Ten than we saw last year, where it felt like almost everybody had a portal quarterback starting for them outside of like Penn State. That's kind of an interesting change. I guess some of those guys did have multiple years left. Other teams, they just needed a bridge to a younger guy that they liked on the roster. So not as quarterback heavy this year. Let's go to a guy that will be catching passes from quarterbacks. Dane Key, wide receiver, Kentucky to Nebraska. We both have him on our list. Just a really steady, consistent, big physical athletic pass catcher. I think this is perfect for Nebraska to give Dylan Raiola a big target, big catch radius, strong, tough after the catch. So we were both in agreement there on Dane Key and kind of what did you see? What made you put him on the list?
Well, everything that you just said. I think that Dylan Raiola, he showed a lot of promise as a true freshman starting quarterback in the Big Ten. And when it comes to Nebraska, they had a solid year. I'm so happy that they were able to get back into bowl game contention, but they don't want to necessarily just stay there like at that 6-6, 7-5 kind of range. They want to move to the next level. And I think adding kind of the talent of like a Dane Key to the wide receiver arsenal for Raiola is going to help them take that next step. Now, granted, everything, it really depends on, like kind of the continued development of Dylan Raiola at the quarterback position, as well as Dane Key kind of assimilating into Nebraska's offense. But I think that this is going to be one of these additions that could certainly help Nebraska move to the next level.
Yep, no question. Another guy that we both had on the list in the backfield, Justice Haynes, former 5-star recruit, Alabama, running back transferred to Michigan. This one, look, I'm pretty high on Jordan Marshall. I was very high on him coming out of high school. He seemed to show some stuff there at the end of the season for Michigan that's going to make him a pretty good player in the Big Ten. But this is a school that's relied heavily on having a tandem of running back and being able to go, kind of that 1-2 punch. And quite frankly, with Justice Haynes, maybe the best running back in the transfer market, certainly one of them. And now you've got this, two-headed monster now with Justice Haynes and Jordan Marshall going into next year that I think gives them exactly what they've had recently and maybe even better than some of their tandems they've had recently. I really like this 1-2 punch now for Michigan. And so I have Justice Haynes here, and he'd be closer to 1 than 15 for me if I had to rank him in order.
Yeah, I mean, when it came to Justice Haynes, as soon as his name entered the transfer portal, Ohio State fans remembered the recruiting process. They were kind of, got their hopes up that he was going to possibly consider Ohio State. It never really materialized. And to your point, Mark, I think that, Justice Haynes, that idea of that 1-2 punch that Michigan traditionally likes to do at the running back position, I can see him being able to come in right away. Let's face it. I mean, when it came to, the Michigan running game this past year, Donovan Edwards, it really wasn't, he wasn't as dominant at the running back position. I think that, as you said, with Jordan Marshall and now with Justice Haynes, is maybe like that 1-2 punch. It'll get back to the way that Michigan would prefer to manufacture their running game.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's one of those that just made sense. We look at the fit and everything else there. Let's go back to the offensive line. Offensive guard, I think he's going to play in on the interior, but USC offensive lineman Emmanuel Pregnon goes from USC to Oregon, a big switch. Definitely one of the best offensive linemen in the portal the entire winter. and he goes from one Big Ten team to another, going from USC to Oregon. Oregon was my number one team in the portal in the Big Ten on last week's episode. I think it was Chip's number 2 team in the Big Ten on last week's episode. So we're very high on the Oregon transfer class. This one, again, they're trying to rebuild that offensive line. They lose Josh Conerly, who's going to be a high draft pick. They lose some other guys on that offensive line. They need to shore that up. This was a really good fit for them.
Yeah, I think when it comes to Oregon, I mean, they definitely are making all the right moves in the transfer portal as well as in recruiting. So I think, adding a player, the caliber of Pregnon, to their offensive line, because that's going to be an offense in transition. Let's face it. I mean, like they're losing a lot of talent. They have a lot of talent still there. We're talking about when it comes to like the transfer portal and recruiting, but Pregnon is going to be one of these guys that can come in and certainly get that offense solidified.
And then you've also got, we're going to stay at Oregon here, Isaiah World, offensive tackle, coming to Oregon from Nevada. This was a guy who, once he entered the portal, had a lot of attention around him, a lot of people very, very interested in Isaiah World. Oregon won that battle. Again, another West Coast program, so they're kind of able to keep him out on the West Coast, keep him from going east. Big athletic tackle prospect. Again, you're replacing maybe the best tackle in the country in Josh Conerly Jr. And now you get Isaiah World in there and just repairing that offensive line.
Yeah. I mean, offensive tackle is a premium. I mean, I said it at the very beginning when we were talking about impactful, look at, when it comes to the NFL, the NFL draft, traditionally, you see offensive tackles go off the board very high. When it comes to NFL free agency, it's usually a premium position. This is no exception. So when it comes to Isaiah World, I see him sliding in and definitely, like I said, kind of with Pregnon helping to get that offensive line solidified for Oregon so that they can try to defend their Big Ten championship that they earned this past year and possibly win another one next season.
Let's stick in the Big Ten with offensive tackles. Let's head east to Columbus because Ohio State also needed to rebuild their offensive line. They're losing both of their offensive tackles. That was a huge thing for them in the portal. They pick up Ethan Onyeonwa from Rice, one of the best offensive tackles in the portal, one of the most experienced offensive tackles in the portal. And again, I think this was a must-get for Ohio State. We'll talk about another guy they got here in a minute. But Onyeonwa gives them – they needed an experienced guy. They needed a guy who's got a couple dozen starts under his belt. And, again, this is a high-end offensive tackle prospect.
Yeah, Onyeonwa, I mean, what is very encouraging as an Ohio State fan is the fact that, now granted, wasn't playing in any of the college football playoff games, but was there participating, was actively, involved in practices, and just the word coming out is like, this guy is just massive. And considering the Ohio State offensive line has been under scrutiny in terms of with the recruiting as well as with the development, and they played extremely well in the college football playoff. I don't want there to be any misunderstanding about that, is that a guy of his caliber being able to come in and possibly take over at that left tackle position, help to solidify that offensive line so Ohio State doesn't miss a beat.
Yes, and we'll get back to the Ohio State offensive line in a minute, but there's another guy who was on both of our lists here that's heading to Ohio State, and that's Max Clare, the tight end from Purdue. This was another big one in terms of, the rich getting richer, kind of talk about the poor robbing the rich, but this was the rich robbing the poor. Maybe probably the best tight end prospect in the transfer portal this cycle, coming from Purdue, caught a ton of passes last year for Purdue. Ohio State had something going there with Cade Stover a couple of years ago. They did not throw a ton of tight ends. G. Scott did a nice job for them this year, but it wasn't like a staple of the offense. You put someone like Max Clare out there with Jeremiah Smith, with Carnell Tate, with Brandon Ennis, that can really open things up for Ohio State. So I think that's a game changer for the Ohio State passing offense.
Yeah, and the fact that Max Clare being an Ohio guy from Cincinnati, I'm always partial. That's not the reason why he's on the list. I mean, the fact that he was for a, let's face it, like Purdue had what they would love to consider a very forgettable season this past year. He was one of the very few bright spots that Purdue had. So as soon as he announced that he was in the transfer portal, the fact that Ohio State was able to get him, like you said, I think he just adds another dimension to the Ohio State passing offense. It's going to be looking a little different in 2025 with a brand new quarterback. We don't know who that is, but like you just rattled off, I think Max Clare is going to be one of those guys, could be a very good security blanket for whoever the quarterback is.
And I will go, we got, I think, a couple more here that line up. We got two more here that are on both lists. So both are, one more offensive lineman, and that is Connor Moore from Montana State to Michigan State. This one's huge. This one for me ranks really high on the impact list. Connor Moore was a guy a lot of teams wanted. Ohio State wanted him. Michigan State was able to snatch him before he was able to visit Ohio State and get the commitment. He'll come right in and probably start a tackle for Michigan State. This is a team that did have some issues on the offensive line this year. They really want to protect Aiden Childs, their talented young quarterback. They've got these really good receivers that they need to have. The quarterback needs to have time to find. I think this was a huge, huge pickup for them on the impact scale.
Yeah, Connor Moore was one of those guys that as soon as he announced that he was in the transfer portal, Ohio State fans were, even though that they had, some offensive tackles already secured, you can never have too many. And just the simple reality that, yeah, he went to Michigan State and never came to Ohio State. I mean, it was kind of like, oh man, like that would have been a nice pickup for the Buckeyes. But compliments to Michigan State for landing a very impactful position. Like you said, somebody who can protect Aiden Childs, help Michigan State get back into a winning side of the ledger.
Yep. And then our last one who appeared on both lists, Dylan Thieneman from Purdue to Oregon, the safety. This was another one, maybe the best safety prospect in the portal, goes to Oregon. That was another Big Ten battle. With Ohio State. Oregon wins that one. Should slot right in and start and really be one of the top players on Oregon's defense next year.
And another guy that Ohio State was really hoping would, that there was some interest, but by Ohio State couldn't get him to visit. And I wouldn't be surprised if he goes over to Oregon and is a playmaker in that secondary.
Yep. So those were all of our guys that were on the same list. We do have some guys who were only on one, and so we can kind of get into that. I'll start with someone on Chip's list who probably would be on my list if I was just ranking the 10 or 15 best players, or if I was doing this in terms of like long-term, like career impact over the course of maybe 2 or 3 years, because he's not a one-year rental. But for the purposes of just pure impact in 2025, I couldn't take any of these other guys off the list. But Phillip Daniels, Minnesota right tackle to Ohio State. He's going to have the leg up on the right tackle competition at Ohio State with Ethan Onyanwa likely on the left side. Redshirt sophomore, started the last few games for Minnesota last year. Very talented, high upside kid with 3 years left of eligibility. So I can see Chip why you put him on there.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about Onyanwa and the fact that Daniels, he's the other guy that was, he was at practices and people were just like, man, these guys are just huge. And that's not necessarily the end all be all, but the fact that, when you are going to be losing, let's face it, you're going to be losing both offensive tackles and it's going to be an offensive line in transition. Both of them come in. I mentioned it earlier. I think like anytime that you have an Ohio kid that has the opportunity to come back, and he wanted the Ohio, this better than anyone, Mark, that he wanted the Ohio State offer. He went to Minnesota, got off to a great start in terms of like his initial development, but the fact that he gets to come back and play for Ohio State is tremendous.
We'll go with one of mine now. We'll go back to Michigan State for a minute. This kid is ranked. Look, I am going to take a huge victory lap on this in 12 months, maybe even not 12 months. I might be able to do this in September. I'm going to take a huge victory lap on this one. This kid is ranked in the 247 transfer portal player rankings as the number 438th best transfer portal player in this class. And I'm putting him in my top 15 most impactful Big Ten transfers. That is Kent State wide receiver Krishawn McCray to Michigan State. This is going to open up Michigan State's offense, if they can protect up front, to a level that's going to allow them to just do so much more offensively this year. He is an ideal guy to play in the slot. He can also take the top off the defense from the slot. He is big time speed, big time quickness. I think he had 8 touchdowns this past year. He is an electric open field runner. And you pair him with March at Michigan State, and that is just a tremendous wide receiver. I think this kid is going to be tremendous at Michigan State. I think he's going to be tremendous very early, and people are going to be like, where the heck did he come from? And I'm going to tell you guys, if you would have listened to this podcast, you would have known that there's no chance on this earth there are 437 better transfer prospects than Krishan McCray.
The thing is, I just mentioned how Max Clare was kind of like one of the few bright spots for Purdue. For McCray, I mean, like Kent State had a really tough year as well. So it's like, to your point, I think coming in, being able to be part of, a larger group that will help Aiden Childs again in his development as a passer. I can see why you put him in, and it's going to be interesting to see, how quickly he does make an impact at Michigan State.
I shortchanged him. He had 9 touchdowns this year. So true freshman year at Kent State, 41 catches, 610 yards, 4 touchdowns. True sophomore year at Kent State this year, 40 catches, 705 yards, 9 touchdowns. That is a 17.6 yards per catch. So big play guy to go with Marsh, the bigger body player. This is such a perfect fit. I think he's going to do great at Michigan State. Let's move on to the next one. Let's go up north. You've got a couple of Michigan guys here we can talk about. I really like Michigan's transfer class. If this had been 5 to 10 more guys, I probably would have like 4 more Michigan players on my list. They had so many good players, but it's just, we're trying to do impact. So like, Indiana gets a quarterback who's going to start for them, and that's going to be high impact, or, a big time receiver going somewhere is going to be high impact to like, a Michigan State or a Minnesota or something like that. So, or Nebraska with getting Dane Key is going to be a huge impact. So like, it was hard for me to put some of these guys on there, but they're absolutely tremendous additions for Michigan. Let's start with linebacker Troy Bowles, who I covered coming out of Florida. He went to Georgia for whatever reason, just didn't work there. Goes to Michigan. This kid just flies. I love Troy Bowles. I think it's gonna be a big get for Michigan. But he's on Chip's list.
Yeah. As you said, you covered him in recruiting. I remember listening to you and Kevin talk about how he would be an ideal fit in the Ohio State defense. It never panned out for Ohio State coming out of high school. He went to Georgia, like you said, for whatever reason, it didn't work at Georgia. I have every confidence, unfortunately, as an Ohio State fan, that it is going to work out at Michigan, that he's going to fit that defensive scheme very well. Like you said, flies to the ball. I think, that kind of active disruption type of player at the linebacker position for Michigan. I wouldn't be surprised if we start hearing about him during the spring when play resumes in terms of like spring practices.
Michigan had a really good defensive class. Like, these guys didn't make our list, but like could easily have been on the list or just in the next few off the list. Like Trey Williams, defensive tackle from Clemson, Damon Payne, defensive lineman from Alabama. And the guy I really like is TJ Metcalf, the safety from Arkansas. So they have really re-solidified their defense. They're losing a lot to the NFL off their defense. They've done a really good job here solidifying it. So I just wanted to shout those guys out, those players out that didn't make my list, but that I fully believe are going to be really good players for Michigan. You had another Michigan player here, Donovan McCulley, wide receiver from Indiana, and your explanation is probably going to explain why he wasn't on my list. But go ahead, Chip. What about
okay?
Donovan?
All right. So I mean, again, to each their own. What I like about him is that he just kind of has that look and style of the traditional lanky Michigan wide receiver that is, all right, maybe not necessarily going to be, burning you down the field, but okay, like really good possession receiver. Again, we talked about it earlier with Justice Haynes that Michigan, their offensive philosophy is predominantly built around a strong running game. And then the passing game is built off like the play action, and where I see Donovan McCulley coming in and being able to be a dependable receiver for the Michigan quarterback, no matter whoever it winds up being. So again, it didn't work out for him at Indiana, but that's, again, I could see him fitting in well at Michigan.
Yeah, I think he's boom or bust for me, and that's kind of why I was a little afraid. I think I went with a little more, sure thing. Like, leaves Indiana, like, before the season was over, like, earlier in the season, hasn't played. Just, like, he's a wild card for me. He could absolutely end up being one of the like, hidden gems of this transfer class, 1,000%. So, but for that reason, I kind of left him off. As I look at our list here, there's one guy we didn't talk about that is on both of our lists. So I want to double back to that real quick. Okay. Williams Nwaneri, defensive end from Missouri to Nebraska. There's people who are talking about, well, he wasn't as productive. I think he was only a freshman this past year. He wasn't as productive as he should have been. This is a guy who could be a first-round draft pick. Premium position, pass rusher. Is there some bust potential here? Yeah, probably a little bit, but holy cow, guys this talented don't end up in the portal very often.
Right. And like you said, it's like the position he plays as a pass rusher. I mean, he's classified, within the rankings as an edge player. And, Nebraska has, a pretty exotic defensive alignment, and, they'll, I'm sure, be very liberal in terms of how they move him around, to try and get him in the best position to wreak havoc on the opposition passing game. But like you said, boom or bust, but I like the physical skills that you see, that are just visibly evident. And I see, kind of going back to my thing about Nebraska, I think, being very selective within the transfer portal to get those guys that's going to push them over that. I'm just going to say that kind of like mediocre area, get them back into a Big Ten contention area.
I think we've covered Chip's entire list now. We let him kind of go on the Michigan, talk about the Michigan guys he had there. So I think we're down to just my last few guys here on my list. If I'm not mistaken, Chip, just go ahead and, as I'm talking here, go look over your list and make sure we didn't blow past anybody. But in the meantime, a guy that I added here, Tacario Davis, cornerback going from Arizona to Washington. Washington needs to, plug some gaps, especially on that defense. And I think Davis is one of the best corners in the portal. And I would argue the best corner entering the Big Ten out of the portal this year. So that was a big one for me. Chip, I know we talked about Washington a little bit last week, just kind of needing to get their feet underneath them. They kind of survived last season with all the turnover. I think a player like Tacario Davis will help them kind of make sure they don't lose any ground nationally or in the Big Ten.
The only guy that we didn't cover on my list, you were asking me to double check it,
yes.
Mekhi Hughes. That was
okay.
When it comes to about Oregon, just kind of restocking at a critical position. Hughes is one of those guys, really talented running backs that can come in. When it comes to that Oregon offense, it's gonna be different, just considering the fact that they are losing a lot of talent, but they've got a lot of talent waiting in the wings, and they're also bringing in a lot of talent from the transfer portal. And I could see Mekhi Hughes coming in and making an immediate contribution at that critical running back position within that Oregon offense.
Yes, that's a really nice pickup out of Tulane. Was certainly under consideration for me. I went in a different direction with a running back. I went with A.J. Turner from Marshall to Minnesota. Running the ball has been such a big part of Minnesota's DNA over the past really forever. But under PJ Fleck, they're a run-first team. They've got good backs in the system, but A.J. Turner, I think, gives them a little even extra juice. This is a kid who, as a redshirt sophomore this year at Marshall, rushed for 864 yards on just 104 carries, 8.3 yards a carry, 6 touchdowns, 2 touchdowns through the air. So he scored 8 touchdowns this year, a long of 88 yards. He had a bunch of 50-plus yarders, I think. If I go back and look at his game log here, he had an 80-yarder, a 69-yarder, a 67-yarder, an 88-yarder. So he had 4+ runs of 60 yards or more this year for Marshall. So he's a home run hitter. I think it's a great compliment to what Minnesota wants to do offensively with pounding the football, get that little home run hitter in there with them, with that stable of backs they have. So that was a big one for me. Like I said, I agree with you on Mekhi Hughes going from Tulane, Oregon. That's going to be a really nice one for them. Another guy, I think it's my last one, assuming I didn't overlook anybody, Javon Tracy. I would go back to the MAC here. Another receiver from the MAC. Javon Tracy, wide receiver, Miami, Ohio, to Minnesota. Again, I just talked about how much they want to run the ball, but in order to be able to do that, you have to have some receivers that actually scare the defense. And Javon Tracy was a star this year at Miami of Ohio as a sophomore, 57 catches, 818 yards, 7 touchdowns, 6 foot, 200 pounds, big physical kid. I think he comes right in and helps open up their passing game, helps open up things for the run game immediately. I think that was a big add for a team who I think desperately needs more on the outside from their outside receivers.
Yeah, Minnesota, I mean, we've been talking about it, but I mean, for all of the criticism and ridicule, I'm just going to say that PJ Fleck gets, like a lot of people, calling him a snake oil salesman. That guy, in terms of, being able to identify players within the transfer portal, being able to develop players that they've acquired via the transfer portal. I have to give him his credit. I mean, Minnesota is one of the just a traditionally physical team year in, year out. So to your point, when it came to, the acquisition of AJ Turner at running back, but also Javon Tracy at wide receiver, two important players added to that Minnesota offense that's going to keep them solid.
Yeah. And, in regards to Fleck, I fully acknowledge, like, he's not everyone's cup of tea, and I understand that. He is intense, almost over the top. But I will say this, I don't think it's a front. I think that's how he's wired.
Yeah.
I've known a few people who have worked for him. He's just that nuts. He's just that intense. That is just how he's wired. But I realize that's not everyone's cup of tea. But I think he's done a really good job at Minnesota. It's not an easy job.
It isn't.
That's one of the harder jobs in the Big Ten. He's kept them competitive, continues to do so, even in an era where maybe he doesn't have the most NIL resources, in an era where it's hard. You do these great evaluations. You get someone, like a Phillip Daniels, and then he just goes to Ohio State on you. You develop him for 2 years, and you lose him to Ohio State. And, but they've done a great job of scouting and development. Coy Parrish is a superstar. We'll have an episode of our best players in the Big Ten at some point this offseason. Coy Parrish will be on my list for sure. And they found him, obviously an in-state kid. They found him well before anybody. Ohio State tried to come in and poach him late. Didn't happen. Stuck with Minnesota. Was one of maybe the handful of best freshmen in the country. He's unbelievable freshman year. So they do a good job there. And it's going to be interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see kind of how they can pieces. They've got some interesting transfers in my mind. They had a pretty good year last year. It'll be interesting to see if they can kind of take the next step next year.
Yeah. I mean, what I was going to say about Minnesota, because I completely agree with you. It's not an easy place to win. Let's face it. I mean, one of the things that, I know that Lou Holtz is and deservedly so, on the gets the ire of Ohio State fans, especially nowadays. But one of the humorous things that Lou Holtz said back in the day, I do remember being old enough when Lou Holtz was the head coach at Minnesota, is that he referenced the back page of the USA Today newspaper. And he's like, I always notice that it's always in blue, in color, the color of, Minnesota, the fact that it was cold, it's difficult to recruit there. And when Minnesota, the critique I would have of Minnesota is that, they had Glenn Mason. They felt that, okay, I realized their feelings were hurt that he interviewed for the Ohio State job. They fired him. Then they went through mediocrity. They had Jerry Kill. And unfortunately, Jerry Kill, with his ongoing health issues, he had to step down. To your point, PJ Fleck, yeah, he's not everyone's cup of tea, but he has Minnesota competitive year in, year out within the Big Ten. They show up to play and win in their bowl game. So, Minnesota is definitely a team that you can't overlook. I know Ohio State plays them at home in October, but yeah, to your point, I think Coy Parrish, one of those guys that, comes in as a true freshman. As you said, Ohio State was really thinking that, we can sweet talk him into leaving his home state. No, they could not. So that's a credit to, the job that Fleck is doing up there.
Yep. So we'll see. Hit us up in the comments with who we missed or with who some of your top who your most impactful transfers are in the Big Ten. I would love to have a discussion with everyone in the comments. I'll jump in for sure and have some discussion about that if anyone has some differing thoughts from what we have here. But I thought the Big Ten did a great job in the winter portal window, and there was a lot of guys that we could have put on here that we didn't, and just got to cut the list off at some point. But that was an interesting, I thought, episodes kind of looking around the Big Ten, some of the impactful transfers. We'll continue to talk transfer portal. I think we'll have maybe some pre-spring type stuff, pre-spring storyline type stuff. Maybe we'll talk about here in the coming weeks. Some coaching moves happening around the league with the assistants, especially. Ohio State's getting gutted a little bit right now. I'm sure we'll be talking about some coaching additions and changes and things that have transpired there and throughout the league and in future episodes here. But appreciate everyone watching and listening, and we'll see you guys next time.
Take care.